August 25th, 1944. Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. Private Emmanuel Green of the 3214th Quartermaster Service Company stood beside his GMC Jimmy truck, watching the convoy staging area transform into something that would reshape German strategic calculations. Through the morning haze, he counted row after row of identical trucks, their engines idling in mechanical chorus, drivers climbing into cabs, preparing for a mission that would prove German military doctrine catastrophically wrong. "We thought supply lines were Germany's advantage," Green would later write in his diary. "We had no idea what American industry could accomplish at this scale." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Around him, 3,558 trucks prepared to roll eastward on this inaugural day. Most drivers were young African-American soldiers, barely past their teenage years, pressed into service from artillery units, infantry reserves, support battalions. Few had driven trucks larger than family cars. Some from rural backgrounds or inner cities had never driven at all. Yet these inexperienced men were about to operate the most ambitious logistics system in military history, a system that would mathematically prove the impossibility of German victory through simple arithmetic. The Germans called their Eastern Offensive Blitzkrieg, Lightning War, the tactical doctrine that conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, pushed deep into Russia on mechanized thrust and tactical brilliance. German propaganda celebrated panzer divisions racing across landscapes, dive bombers screaming from cloudless skies, the modern face of mechanized warfare. The world believed Germany had mastered industrial combat. What none of them knew, what German intelligence would discover through captured supply documents over the following months, was that America was about to demonstrate logistics capacity that made German achievements look primitive. The mathematics were about to speak with brutal clarity. Industrial democracy would prove superior to fascist militarism, not through courage or tactical skill, but through the unglamorous reality of ton-miles delivered per day. The crisis had begun exactly 1 month earlier. On July 25, 1944, General Omar Bradley's First Army launched Operation Cobra, breaking through Normandy hedgerows after nearly 8 weeks of grinding attrition warfare. The breakthrough released something unprecedented. Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army became operational on August 1st and erupted across the French countryside at speeds that exceeded every historical precedent for sustained offensive movement. Patton's armour covered 75 miles in single days. The German 7th Army collapsed. By mid-August, Allied forces had encircled German positions at the Falaise Pocket, eliminating approximately 50,000 enemy soldiers, leaving another 10,000 dead. The road to Paris lay open. The German border beckoned beyond. But victory created its own crisis, one that would test whether American logistics could sustain what American arms had achieved. The Allied advance had outrun every pre-invasion projection. Each American division in combat operations consumed approximately 750 tons of supplies daily, everything from ammunition and fuel to rations and medical supplies. With 28 divisions pushing eastward simultaneously, daily requirements approached 21,000 tons. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. The pre-invasion bombing campaign that crippled German reinforcement capabilities had also devastated French infrastructure. Allied bombers had methodically destroyed every major rail line in northern France to prevent German counterattacks. The strategy succeeded militarily but created logistical nightmare. Traditional supply methods could not function. The major French ports remained in German hands. Cherbourg had been captured, but German demolitions rendered it nearly useless until late September. The port of Antwerp, captured on September 4th, would not open for shipping until November 28th. Every ton of supplies still came across Normandy beaches through makeshift Mulberry harbours, artificial ports towed from England and assembled in the Channel. By late June, these innovative structures had unloaded 170,000 vehicles, 7.5 million gallons of fuel, 500,000 tons of supplies. The system worked, but could not keep pace with Patton's advance. Distance created the fundamental problem. Each mile eastward added 2 miles to supply runs, 1 mile loaded, 1 mile returning empty. The supply line was consuming itself through movement. The solution emerged from a 36-hour brainstorming session in late August, involving Colonel Lorin Albert Ayers, known to his men as Little Patton, and Major Gordon Gravel. These Transportation Corps officers faced unprecedented challenge. They needed to move massive tonnages over distances exceeding anything American logistics had previously attempted, using roads not designed for heavy military traffic, through country still partially occupied by German forces. The solution they devised borrowed terminology from American railroad practice. Since the 1890s, Santa Fe Railroad had marked priority express shipments with red balls painted on freight car sides. Around 1892, the railroad began using this designation for perishable goods and priority freight needing immediate transport. By the 1920s, red ball designation indicated fastest, highest priority cargo throughout American railroads. Trains carrying red ball freight received absolute priority. All traffic cleared for their passage would be applied to trucks on an unprecedented scale. Colonel Ayers and Major Gravel designed a one-way loop system. 2 parallel routes would connect Normandy supply dumps to forward logistics bases near Chartres, approximately 125 miles inland. The northern route would carry loaded trucks eastward. The southern route would carry empty trucks back to the coast. Both routes would be closed to all civilian traffic and have absolute priority over all other military movements. Military police would control every intersection. No convoy would stop for anything except mechanical failure or enemy action. The plan required assembling massive truck fleet in record time. 132 existing Transportation Corps truck companies were consolidated into single mammoth operation. The primary vehicle was the GMC CCKW, a 2.5-ton 6-wheel drive truck, universally known as the Jimmy or the Deuce and a Half. General Motors had designed this workhorse in 1940 and began serious production in February 1941. Over 560,000 would be manufactured before production ended in 1945, making it the second most produced American military vehicle after the Jeep. The CCKW designation came from GM's naming convention. C indicated the 1941 model year. The second C designated conventional cab configuration. K meant all-wheel drive with powered front axle. W indicated twin dual-wheel rear axles. The name Jimmy came from soldiers' pronunciation of GMC letters. The Deuce and a Half referred to its 2.5-ton payload capacity. The truck featured a GMC 270 engine, an overhead valve inline 6 producing 91.5 horsepower in early models, later versions generating 104 horsepower at 2,750 revolutions per minute. The engine delivered 216 pound-feet of torque at 1,400 RPM. This gasoline engine, originally designed for commercial trucks, proved remarkably reliable in military service. The 3.5-inch bore combined with 4-inch stroke created displacement of 269.5 cubic inches. Power flowed through Warner T93 5-speed transmission. Fourth gear was direct drive. Fifth was overdrive, allowing the truck to maintain highway speeds while conserving fuel. Early CCKWs featured closed metal cabs from GM's commercial truck line. By July 1943, production switched to open cabs with canvas roofs and doors. This design change served multiple purposes. It simplified manufacturing when every hour counted. It reduced shipping height, allowing more trucks to fit on cargo vessels. It improved ventilation in hot climates. It increased visibility for drivers navigating crowded roads and dangerous terrain. Standard cargo beds measured 12 feet long. Early beds used steel construction. As steel became increasingly rationed for armor plate and ship construction, wooden beds replaced them. These proved unsatisfactory, warping under load and weather. A composite design emerged, combining steel sides and framing with wooden bottom slats. This hybrid approach provided strength where needed while conserving strategic materials. Finding drivers proved more challenging than assembling trucks. The Transportation Corps needed 23,000 drivers and mechanics immediately. Many would come from other units whose duties were not immediately critical. Able-bodied soldiers found themselves reassigned overnight. Artillery men became truck drivers. Infantry reserves transformed into convoy operators. Most received minimal truck driving instruction. Many had never driven anything larger than family car. Some, coming from rural backgrounds or inner cities, had never driven at all. They would learn through necessity, through trial and error, through informal knowledge shared between exhausted men, trying to keep vehicles moving. The peculiarities of military logistics and American racism converged to create the composition of the Red Ball Express. Approximately 75% of Red Ball drivers were African American soldiers. This resulted directly from segregation policies that pervaded the American military in 1944. Military doctrine held, without any factual basis, that black soldiers lacked intelligence and courage for combat roles. Consequently, African Americans were systematically assigned to service and support units, working as truck drivers, quartermaster personnel, engineers, port battalion laborers. This racist policy would inadvertently create one of the war's most critical and celebrated operations. Private James Rucard of Maple Heights, Ohio, was 19 years old when assigned to the Red Ball Express. He had been drafted in March 1943 and sent to Company C, 514th Quartermaster Regiment. Staff Sergeant Chester Jones, with the 3418th Trucking Company, had similar experiences. Ernest Myers, of the 3214th Quartermaster Service Company, articulated what many felt. "We wanted to make an impression for the people back home. We wanted to show that black men were combat-ready." These young men, mostly under 24 years old, suddenly bore responsibility for sustaining entire armies. They understood the weight of that responsibility and the opportunity to prove themselves that had been denied in combat roles. What they could not know was that their success would provide German intelligence with mathematical proof of Allied industrial superiority, so overwhelming that victory became impossible for the Reich. The Red Ball Express launched on Friday, August 25, 1944, with 67 truck companies. 3,558 trucks, mostly jimmies, hauled 4,482 tons of time. Supplies on the inaugural run. The convoy rolled out from staging areas near Saint-Lô, heading eastward on dedicated routes toward the Chartres-Dreux area, where forward supply depots had been established to feed American armies racing toward the Seine. Just 4 days later, on August 29th, the operation had expanded dramatically. 132 truck companies now participated, operating 5,958 vehicles that carried 12,342 tons in a single day, setting the single-day record that would never be exceeded during the operation's 83-day lifetime. Official regulations were strict and sensible. Trucks would travel in convoys of at least 5 vehicles, escorted by jeeps in front and rear. Drivers must maintain 60-yard intervals to prevent single enemy bomb or strafing run from destroying multiple vehicles. Maximum speed was set at 25 miles per hour for safe operation on narrow French roads. Passing was forbidden to maintain convoy integrity. During night operations, trucks operated under blackout conditions using cat-eye headlight covers that emitted only tiny slits of light, enough to mark their presence but not enough to attract German aircraft. Reality quickly diverged from regulations. The urgency of the mission and the personality of the drivers created very different operation. Veteran mechanic Fred Ree, serving in an ambulance unit, remembered them vividly. "Oh boy, do I remember that Red Ball gang. They were a hell of a crew. They used to carry ammunition boxes twice as high as the top of the truck, and when they went down the highway, they swayed back and forth. Those guys were crazy, like they were getting paid for every run." Drivers immediately began removing engine governors that limited trucks to 56 miles per hour. These governors sapped power on hills and prevented maintaining steady high speeds on straightaways. Drivers slapped the governors back on for inspections, then removed them again for actual runs. Speed became everything. Individual trucks routinely ignored the convoy system, departing Cherbourg as soon as they were loaded, rather than waiting for escort jeeps. Drivers pushed their jimmies to 60 miles per hour and beyond, racing through French villages and countryside. They developed motto borrowed from French, tout de suite, meaning immediately, right now. This became operational philosophy. Get loaded, get moving, get there, get back, do it again. The convoys ran 24 hours daily. Drivers worked in two-man teams sharing single truck. One man drove while the other tried to sleep in the passenger seat, an exercise in futility given rough roads and constant motion. After 2 hours, they switched positions. The round trip from Normandy to Chartres and back took 54 hours of continuous operation. Meanwhile, in Berlin, German intelligence officers were beginning to receive troubling reports from multiple sources. Prisoner interrogations from captured German soldiers in France and Italy contained remarkably consistent accounts. Every interrogated prisoner described American supply abundance that seemed wasteful by German standards. They spoke of entire meals being thrown away because soldiers disliked the taste. They described American vehicles being abandoned after minor mechanical problems because it was easier to requisition new one than repair the old. They recounted seeing supply dumps larger than anything in German army, containing food, ammunition, fuel, equipment in quantities that appeared unlimited. Some accounts seemed so extreme that interrogators initially suspected exaggeration or Allied propaganda, but consistency across hundreds of independent interrogations made dismissal impossible. Officers and enlisted men, paratroopers and infantry, tank crews and artillerymen all told same stories of overwhelming American material superiority. More significantly, these accounts matched what German forces were experiencing on other fronts. In Sicily, captured in July and August 1943, German forces encountered similar patterns. In Italy, where Allied forces landed in September 1943, the pattern repeated. Everywhere German forces engaged Americans, they found enemies with seemingly unlimited supplies. Then captured documents began arriving in Berlin in greater numbers, and these could not be dismissed as subjective impressions. Unlike prisoner accounts, supply documents were clinical, bureaucratic, undeniable. They were not meant to impress or intimidate. They were simply routine paperwork of American military logistics, mundane forms that tracked supplies through military distribution system. And the numbers they contained would prove apocalyptic for German strategic planning. The contrast with German logistics was stark and devastating. While American trucks raced at breakneck speeds, the vaunted Wehrmacht still depended heavily on horses. This shocking reality contradicted German propaganda and Allied perceptions. The Blitzkrieg created an image of total German mechanization, panzer columns racing across landscapes while dive bombers screamed overhead. But it was largely illusion, a facade maintained by careful propaganda photography that showed Germany's most modern units while hiding the horse-drawn reality of most formations. German armoured and motorised divisions constituted only small fraction of the Wehrmacht. The vast majority of German units moved on foot or with horse-drawn transport. The numbers told remarkable story that would have shattered Nazi propaganda had it been widely known during the war. Germany entered World War II with 514,000 horses. Over the course of the war, the Wehrmacht employed approximately 2.75 million horses and mules in total. At any given time during the war, approximately 1.1 million horses served in German military operations. This exceeded the horse populations used by most armies in the First World War, supposedly the last major conflict before mechanization. A typical 1941 German infantry division included around 5,000 horses requiring 53 tons of hay and oats daily. These animals did not produce that fodder. They consumed it. Every ton of horse feed was ton that could not be ammunition, fuel for vehicles, or rations for soldiers. Horses had severe practical limitations that became increasingly apparent as war progressed. They could not operate more than 25 miles from railhead before fodder supplies began requiring more transport space than ammunition and weapons. Yet German infantry divisions during Operation Barbarossa routinely found themselves 90 miles from nearest railhead, creating impossible supply demands. The horses ate everything available. During one summer month in 1941 alone, German forces requisitioned 112 tons of oats and 768 tons of hay from Russian farms. Hungry horses gnawed wooden beams, tree trunks, even walls. They consumed cotton feed bags, leading to digestive problems. Roughage often arrived mouldy, causing illness. Horses died in enormous numbers that would have been catastrophic for mechanized force. 179,000 horses perished in December 1941 and January 1942 alone during the first Russian winter. More than the total number of tanks Germany produced during entire war. A German soldier wrote in his memoir that a curious odor would stick to Russian campaign. This mixture of fire, sweat, and horse corpses. The Wehrmacht's dependence on horses created catastrophic logistical limitations that directly impacted operational capabilities. Horse-drawn columns clogged roads that should have carried motorized supplies forward. Horses moved slowly, approximately 3 to 4 miles per hour under load, compared to trucks capable of 40 to 50 miles per hour. They required rest, feeding, grooming, and veterinary care that consumed manpower and time. They panicked under artillery fire, often stampeding and disrupting operations. German armoured spearheads repeatedly found themselves far ahead of their supporting infantry and supplies, creating dangerous gaps. The famous encirclements at Kiev, Vyazma, and Bryansk might have been even more devastating had German infantry been able to close pockets more rapidly. Instead, horse-drawn units struggled to keep pace with panzers, allowing thousands of Soviet soldiers to escape destruction. The contrast became vivid when German prisoners of war captured after D-Day watched American vehicles roll off landing craft. "Where are the horses?" they asked their guards, genuinely confused. They had never seen army operate without horses. They assumed the massive vehicle parks they observed must be supplemented by even larger numbers of horses, somewhere out of sight. The question revealed enormous gap between German logistics and American industrial capacity. The concept of all-mechanized army was literally incomprehensible to soldiers raised in military culture, where horses remained fundamental. The Red Ball Express operated in completely different realm, representing future of warfare in ways German planners had failed to anticipate. By August 29th, just 4 days after launch, the operation had expanded to 132 truck companies and 5,958 vehicles, the peak that would be maintained through September. At any given moment, approximately 900 trucks were on road simultaneously, running 24 hours per day without pause. The statistics became staggering. The Red Ball hauled 12,500 tons of supplies daily at its peak on August 29th. Over its 83-day operational lifetime from August 25th through November 16th, the Express transported 412,193 tons of fuel, ammunition, rations, and equipment. This single truck operation moved more tonnage in less than 3 months than entire German army groups could transport over similar distances in year of operations. The drivers worked under brutal conditions that tested human endurance. 2-man teams shared driving duties on round trips that consumed 54 hours of continuous movement. They drove through rain that turned French roads into rivers of mud. They navigated roads pocked with shell holes from recent combat. They skirted around destroyed vehicles, both Allied and German, that littered roadsides. They drove through areas where German forces had not been fully cleared, risking ambush and sniper fire. Private Emmanuel Green recalled stepping over dead enemy soldiers when his unit reached forward delivery points. Combat had passed through these areas hours earlier, but clearing bodies remained incomplete. He witnessed non-commissioned officer in his company severely injured after triggering landmine near truck Green had been repairing. The NCO survived but lost his leg. Green later named his oldest son in honor of that man, ensuring the sacrifice would be remembered. Red Ball convoys also faced hijackers, who sought cargo for personal use or black market sales. Gasoline, cigarettes, and medical supplies commanded premium prices on black market. Stragglers became especially vulnerable to these criminals, who were sometimes Allied soldiers from other units, sometimes French civilians, and occasionally German infiltrators in American uniforms. The greatest natural enemy proved to be mud. French roads, never designed for thousands of heavy trucks carrying loads far exceeding peacetime standards, disintegrated under constant pounding. Rain turned unpaved sections into quagmires. Trucks bogged down axle deep, their 11-inch wheels unable to generate traction in the soup. Technical problems plagued operation despite Jimmy's reputation for reliability. Red Ball trucks were frequently brought to standstill by water in their gasoline, problem that stemmed from multiple sources. Proper maintenance required purging gas line filter between engine and cab regularly to remove accumulated water, but exhausted drivers running on minimal sleep often skipped this step to save time. Condensation was principal cause in normal circumstances, but sabotage added to problem in ways that enraged American personnel. German prisoners of war, aware through experience or training that water in gas was Achilles' heel of 6x6 design, were frequently used to load supplies and fuel trucks at rear area depots. More than one veteran remembered watching POWs deliberately dragging open jerry cans through snow and rain to contaminate gasoline before loading it onto trucks. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The drivers adapted through necessity and ingenuity. They became expert mechanics through trial and error and informal knowledge sharing. They learned to diagnose engine problems by sound alone, distinguishing between minor issues that could wait and major problems requiring immediate attention. They mastered quick repairs in darkness, working by feel when blackout conditions prevented using lights. The scale of American mechanization awed everyone who witnessed it, friend and foe alike. Germany's most capable mechanized force, the panzer divisions that had swept across Europe between 1939 and 1942, numbered fewer than 30 divisions, out of more than 300 total Wehrmacht divisions. At war's peak, America fielded army where mechanization was not exception but standard that applied to every unit, regardless of type or mission. Every American infantry division had organic motor transport sufficient to move its entire complement of personnel and equipment. Every artillery piece was towed by truck or mounted on self-propelled chassis. Every supply line ran on rubber tires driven by internal combustion engines. The entire system assumed mobility at speeds impossible for horse-drawn forces. The Germans had nothing comparable in scale or sophistication. A 1943 German infantry division supply train employed 256 trucks and 2,652 horses, attended by 4,047 men. These numbers revealed fundamental contradiction in German military organization. The trucks could move faster and carry more, but they were outnumbered by horses more than 10 to 1. The horses limited entire divisions' movement to speed of slowest horse-drawn wagon, typically 3 to 4 miles per hour under load on good roads, less on poor roads or rough terrain. In contrast, a lean 1943 Soviet infantry division supply train, aided significantly by American Lend-Lease trucks, operated with just 91 trucks and 556 horses, attended by 879 men. The Soviets had fewer total vehicles than Germans, but understood fundamental principle that mobile force cannot be chained to immobile elements. The Wehrmacht was literally fighting World War II with logistics that belonged to previous century, reality masked by propaganda films showing panzer columns but never showing horse-drawn supply wagons struggling to keep up. German supply by horse and wagon meant armies could not move faster than walking speed for sustained periods. Armoured spearheads repeatedly outran their supplies, forcing halts that allowed enemies to regroup and establish new defensive lines. This limitation helped save Moscow in 1941, when German logistics collapsed under strain of distances and winter conditions. The Red Ball Express exposed these weaknesses mercilessly through direct comparison. American tanks and infantry advanced at previously impossible speeds because their logistics could keep pace through superior organization and overwhelming industrial capacity. Patton's Third Army covered 400 miles in less than a month during August 1944, advancing so rapidly that German forces could not establish coherent defensive lines. Towns that might have been defended fell without significant resistance because German reinforcements could not arrive in time. By late August, Patton had reached Meuse River. His spearheads crossed on August 31st, establishing bridgeheads that threatened to drive straight into Germany with minimal opposition. The German frontier lay within reach. Victory seemed imminent. Then the advance stopped, not from German resistance, but from American logistics reaching their absolute limit. On August 31st, 1944, Third Army ran out of gasoline near Moselle River, just outside Metz. The Red Ball Express, despite heroic efforts moving 12,000 tons daily, could not deliver enough fuel to sustain Patton's breakneck pace. Every gallon consumed by advancing tanks was gallon that had travelled 200 miles or more from Normandy beaches. The fuel crisis revealed both triumph and limitations of truck-based logistics operating at unprecedented scale and distance. An armoured division required 73,177 gallons of fuel to move 100 miles with all its vehicles fully loaded. With all vehicle tanks filled, division had 121,695 gallons aboard, giving theoretical range of 166 miles. In practice, divisions needed complete refueling daily during offensive operations. Fuel could not be wished into existence or conjured from thin air. Every gallon had to be physically transported from Normandy to wherever divisions operated. Patton's Third Army included multiple armoured divisions, plus mechanized infantry, tank destroyers, self-propelled artillery, and support units. Daily fuel consumption during rapid August advances exceeded 400,000 gallons across entire army. This astronomical figure exceeded capacity of Red Ball Express to deliver, particularly given other critical needs for ammunition, food, and medical supplies. The Red Ball trucks themselves consumed significant fuel. Round trip from Normandy to Chartres, approximately 250 miles, required 60 to 70 gallons per truck, depending on load, terrain, and driving style. With nearly 6,000 trucks operating, Red Ball consumed 360,000 to 420,000 gallons daily just to run itself. This created paradox that supplying the supply line consumed almost as much fuel as supplying combat forces. The fuel shortage of late August and early September 1944 sparked one of war's great debates between senior commanders with fundamentally different strategic visions. General Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, allocated limited supplies according to his broad front strategy. He believed advancing on multiple axes prevented Germans from concentrating reserves against any single thrust, while maintaining flexibility to exploit opportunities wherever they emerged. He gave priority to Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, advancing through Belgium toward Ruhr Industrial Region, Germany's industrial heartland, whose capture would cripple German war economy. Patton fumed that politics and favoritism toward British were crippling his advance at a moment when boldness could have ended war in 1944. He argued, with some justification, that his Third Army had demonstrated superior speed and effectiveness, covering more ground and destroying more enemy forces than any other Allied formation. The truth was more complex than either commander acknowledged. No amount of Red Ball trucks could overcome basic, geographical and physical limitations. Every gallon of fuel came across Normandy beaches and had to travel 200 miles or more to reach forward units operating beyond Paris. The longer advance continued, the more fuel was consumed simply moving supplies forward, creating paradox where success made further success increasingly difficult. The debate raged through September as American forces paused to consolidate gains and rebuild logistics. Engineers performed miracles of reconstruction, restoring rail lines at speeds that seemed impossible. Trains began supplementing trucks, gradually reducing pressure on overtaxed Red Ball routes. The reopening of Antwerp in late November would eventually normalize Allied logistics and end crisis that had threatened to stall entire campaign. But for 83 critical days from August 25th through November 16th, the Red Ball Express represented primary lifeline sustaining American armies advancing across France. Without it, the war in Europe might have continued well into 1946. On November 16th, 1944, Red Ball Express officially ended operations. Rail transport had been restored across much of France. Pipeline systems began delivering fuel directly from ports to forward areas. Port of Antwerp, fully cleared of mines and operational, provided deep water capacity needed to supply multiple armies. The truck convoys became obsolete for long-distance hauling, though trucking remained essential for final delivery to combat units. The statistics of the operation documented unprecedented logistical achievement that exceeded all expectations. Over 500 camps across 45 states had trained personnel involved. 175 main camps, with 325 branch camps, provided organizational structure and replacement personnel. The Express operated 5,958 vehicles at peak capacity. It transported 12,500 tons daily at maximum achieved on August 29. Over its lifetime, it moved 412,193 tons. Drivers contributed 14 million man-days of labor under conditions that would have broken lesser men. They wore out 50,000 tires, an average of more than 8 tires per truck, demonstrating punishing conditions under which they operated. The Red Ball Express achieved something German logistics never could, sustaining offensive operations over distances and at speeds that rendered blitzkrieg tactics obsolete when employed against equally mobile opponents. German armoured advances in Poland covered approximately 200 miles in 5 weeks. The advance into France in 1940 covered 250 miles in 6 weeks. Operation Barbarossa saw German spearheads cover 600 miles in 12 weeks before supply problems and Soviet resistance forced pause. These represented impressive achievements against unprepared or inferior opponents. Patton's Third Army covered 400 miles in 4 weeks against prepared German defences, and only stopped because it outran even American logistics capabilities, not because German forces stopped it. The difference was industrial capacity applied intelligently. American factories produced 2.5 million trucks during World War II. Germany produced approximately 300,000, less than 15% of American output. American trucks were standardized, reliable, designed for mass production, and supported by supply chain that could deliver spare parts anywhere. German trucks were diverse, often unreliable, difficult to maintain, and supported by supply chain disrupted by Allied bombing. The arithmetic was brutal and decisive. American production exceeded German production in virtually every military category. In 1944, United States manufactured 96,000 aircraft. Germany manufactured 39,800. America built 17,376 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany manufactured approximately 9,000. America produced Liberty ship every 42 days on average at peak production, with record being 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Germany's entire merchant marine construction for entire war totaled approximately 1 million tons. United States built over 53 million tons of merchant shipping, more than 50 times German output. These statistics were not abstract numbers. They represented difference between victory and defeat, between armies that could sustain operations and armies that collapsed under logistical strain. The lessons were not lost on German prisoners who witnessed American logistics firsthand. Captured German officers processed through Allied supply systems watched in amazement as endless streams of vehicles, supplies, and equipment poured across Channel. They saw supply dumps that dwarfed anything Wehrmacht had assembled even during height of German power. They recognized that Germany had lost industrial war before first shot was fired in 1939. The Red Ball Express validated assessment that professionals study logistics while amateurs talk tactics. The most brilliant tactical operation cannot succeed without beans, bullets, and gasoline. The most sophisticated weapons cannot function without fuel and ammunition. The best trained soldiers cannot fight without food and medical supplies. Logistics determine what is possible on battlefield. Everything else is commentary. The German blitzkrieg succeeded brilliantly through tactical innovation and operational excellence against opponents who were unprepared or inferior in training and leadership. It failed ultimately and completely because Germany lacked industrial capacity to sustain those operations against major powers with comparable or superior logistics. Once German forces engaged enemies with resources matching or exceeding their own, Wehrmacht's limitations became fatal weaknesses that no amount of tactical skill could overcome. Battle of Moscow in 1941 failed partially due to logistics, with German supply lines stretched beyond breaking, while Soviet forces operating on interior lines could concentrate reserves. Disaster at Stalingrad in 1942 occurred largely due to supply failures, with German forces surrounded and dependent on inadequate airlift, while Soviet forces methodically tightened noose. Defeat in North Africa happened because Rommel could never get adequate fuel and ammunition. His brilliant tactical victories meaningless when his tanks sat immobile for lack of gasoline. The collapse in Normandy and France accelerated once Allied logistics began functioning effectively, overwhelming German defensive efforts through sheer material superiority. American truck drivers, 3/4 of them black soldiers facing discrimination at home, demonstrated that democracy could organize better, produce more, and fight harder than fascism. They proved that nation-respecting individual initiative, even imperfectly and incompletely, could outperform one built on rigid hierarchy and racial mythology. They showed that free peoples, properly equipped and led, could accomplish extraordinary things. The African-American soldiers of Red Ball Express served with distinction despite facing racism that denied them combat roles and full equality. Ernest Myers of the 3214th Quartermaster Service Company articulated their motivation with simple clarity. We wanted to make an impression for the people back home. We wanted to show that black men were combat ready. They succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. White soldiers who depended on Red Ball supplies recognized drivers' valor, even when broader society refused to grant them equality. An armored division commander praised drivers who delivered gasoline under constant fire with words that acknowledged reality. I would not want their job. They have what it takes. A tank driver with 5th Armored Division stated simple truth: if it was not for Red Ball, we could not have moved. Colonel John Eisenhower, Supreme Commander's son, argued without qualification that without Red Ball truck drivers, advance across France could not have been made. General Patton declared with characteristic bluntness that 2.5-ton truck is our most valuable weapon, more important than tanks or artillery. These statements came from officers in segregated military that officially considered black soldiers unfit for combat roles. The contradiction was not lost on drivers who proved their worth while being denied equality, demonstrated courage while facing discrimination, helped destroy Nazi racial ideology while living under American racial segregation. They understood bitter irony of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. The Red Ball Express became microcosm of Double V campaign that Pittsburgh Courier, influential black newspaper, had promoted since 1942. Victory over fascism abroad, victory over racism at home. African American soldiers saw their service as advancing both causes simultaneously, proving through action what words alone could not demonstrate. Success of Red Ball Express made arguments against black military capability impossible to maintain with any credibility, though racism persisted long after war ended. The implications carried far beyond immediate tactical advantage. The operation demonstrated conclusively that American logistics could support sustained offensive operations against any enemy anywhere. It proved that American industry could outproduce any rival, regardless of their supposed efficiency or dedication. It showed that democratic organization could surpass authoritarian efficiency when properly motivated and led. These lessons shaped post-war military doctrine, fundamentally and permanently. United States military became permanently committed to mechanization and robust logistics as foundation of military power. Every subsequent American military operation, from Korea through Vietnam to Gulf Wars and beyond, has emphasized logistics and supply chain dominance as prerequisites for success. Understanding that amateurs study tactics while professionals study logistics became institutional knowledge embedded in military education and doctrine. Red Ball Express validated this principle definitively and irrefutably. The German officer corps, trained to appreciate operational excellence and professional competence, understood clearly what they had witnessed. Captured generals interrogated extensively about Allied capabilities consistently emphasized American logistics as decisive factor that made German victory impossible regardless of tactical or operational success. German tactical skill remained high throughout war. German equipment, particularly tanks and anti-tank guns, often surpassed Allied equivalents in quality. German soldiers fought tenaciously even when defeat was certain, but none of it mattered against enemy that could deliver unlimited supplies to front, replace losses immediately, and sustain operations indefinitely. The Red Ball Express represented something deeper and more significant than tactical logistics. It embodied American industrial democracy in action, translating abstract principles into concrete results. Civilian truck designs adapted for military use demonstrated value of standardization. Workers from diverse backgrounds trained as drivers showed that talent exists everywhere when opportunity is provided. Officers improvised solutions to unprecedented problems, proving that rigid hierarchy inhibits rather than enables excellence. System worked because individuals at every level took initiative, solved problems creatively, and adapted to changing circumstances without waiting for orders from above. This contrasted sharply with German military culture that emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and following orders without question. Wehrmacht emphasized centralized planning with innovation reserved for senior commanders. Lower ranks executed plans meticulously, but did not modify them even when circumstances changed. When unexpected problems emerged, systems struggled to adapt because adaptation required approval from higher authority that might be unavailable or too distant to respond quickly. Red Ball Express thrived on flexibility and improvisation. Drivers ignored regulations when those regulations hindered mission. They removed governors limiting truck speed because getting supplies forward mattered more than following speed limits. They exceeded weight limits because delivering ammunition mattered more than preserving vehicles. They traveled alone rather than in convoys because speed mattered more than following procedures. Officers tolerated and sometimes encouraged this behavior because results mattered more than rules. Military police enforced rules that mattered, particularly absolute priority for Red Ball convoys, while ignoring violations that did not compromise mission. This pragmatic approach succeeded brilliantly where rigid adherence to regulations would have failed. The Red Ball moved more supplies faster than any logistics operation in history to that point. It sustained most rapid sustained advance in modern warfare against prepared opposition. It proved conclusively that democratic systems emphasizing individual initiative could outperform authoritarian ones, emphasizing obedience when properly organized and motivated. In 1985, on 40th anniversary of war's end, surviving Red Ball Express drivers held reunion in Austin, Texas. Over 500 former drivers returned, many bringing families to show them where their contribution to victory had begun. These elderly men, now respected members of their communities, remembered vividly fear, exhaustion, and pride of their service. They had proven themselves under most demanding circumstances. They had demonstrated that Black Americans could perform any mission when given opportunity and proper support. Former Staff Sergeant Ernest Myers, aged 79, delivered remarks that resonated with all present. We drove through night without lights. We drove through enemy territory without weapons. We drove until we could barely stay awake. We did it because we knew our brothers at front needed us. We did it because we wanted to prove what Black Americans could accomplish. We did it because it needed doing. The applause lasted several minutes, washing over Myers in waves of recognition and respect. The magnitude of achievement becomes crystal clear through direct comparison with German capabilities. Entire German military logistics system during Operation Barbarossa, largest military operation in history involving over 3 million men advancing across 2,000-mile front, and consumed more resources to advance 600 miles than Red Ball Express required to sustain advances of 400 miles, while supporting multiple army groups simultaneously operating on much narrower front. Red Ball operated on fraction of frontage with fewer troops, but ton-mile for ton-mile, accounting for distance and tonnage moved, it was exponentially more efficient than anything Wehrmacht accomplished. This efficiency resulted directly from American industrial design, standardization enabling interchangeability of parts, mass production reducing costs and increasing availability, and organizational flexibility, allowing rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. German trucks were excellent vehicles individually, representing high-quality engineering and craftsmanship, but they came in dozens of incompatible types requiring different parts, different maintenance procedures, and different training for operators and mechanics. American trucks were ruthlessly standardized. Every Jimmy used same parts regardless of when or where it was built. Any mechanic trained on Jimmys could repair any Jimmy anywhere. Spare parts were completely interchangeable between vehicles. This mundane reality, boring to discuss but critical in practice, proved decisive in sustained operations. The story of Red Ball Express is ultimately story of victory through long-term preparation meeting immediate necessity. American industrial capacity did not emerge overnight or by accident. It resulted from decades of investment, infrastructure connecting nation, education, creating skilled workers, manufacturing capability, building factories and supply chains, and technological development improving designs and processes. The trucks that won war were designed before war began. Factories that built them were constructed over decades. Road network that allowed their use was built over generations by federal, state, and local governments. Industrial base that supplied them had developed since late 19th century. When war came, America could surge production dramatically because foundation existed and only required expansion rather than creation from nothing. Germany, despite impressive industrial capacity and justifiable pride in engineering excellence, never built that foundation comprehensively. German industry excelled at quality, but failed at quantity. German logistics excelled at pre-war planning, but failed at wartime adaptation. German military culture excelled at obedience, but failed at initiative. These weaknesses, minor in short campaigns against inferior opponents, proved fatal in extended conflict against comparable powers. Red Ball Express exposed all these weaknesses through direct comparison that made excuses impossible. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.
The morning of June 4th, 1942, 20,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Norman Dusty Kleiss gripped the control stick of his Douglas SBD Dauntless, the aircraft trembling as he pushed the nose forward into a 70-degree dive. Below him, the Japanese carrier Kaga maneuvered desperately, her deck crowded with armed and fueled aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the fleet. Tracers arced upward like deadly fireworks. Kleiss had approximately 40 seconds to live or die. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. At 2,000 feet, Kleiss pulled the bomb release lever. The 500-pound bomb dropped away. Then he did something that violated every instinct a pilot possessed. Instead of pulling back on the stick to escape, he rolled the aircraft inverted, dove deeper toward the enemy fleet, then snapped upright and began a violent series of random turns. Hard left, hard right, climb, dive, roll. The Japanese gun crews, trained to track aircraft pulling up and away after bombing runs, found themselves aiming at empty air. Kleiss's rear gunner, radioman John Snowden, watched as anti-aircraft shells detonated where they should have been, where any sane pilot would have been, but weren't. The carrier erupted in flames behind them. They escaped at wave-top height, jinking wildly, while every gun in the Japanese fleet fired at the space they had already vacated. What happened that morning above the Kido Butai would redefine dive-bombing tactics for the remainder of the war. But the story of how American pilots learned to confuse enemy gunners through radical post-attack maneuvers begins not at Midway, but in the classified training documents written months earlier by men who understood a simple truth. Predictability kills. Chaos saves. January 1942, Naval Air Station, North Island, California. The United States had been at war for exactly 37 days. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had demonstrated with terrifying clarity the vulnerability of American naval forces. Across the Pacific, Imperial Japanese Navy carrier strike forces roamed at will, sinking Allied warships, conquering islands, destroying air bases. The Douglas SBD Dauntless represented America's primary offensive weapon against this onslaught. Nicknamed slow but deadly by pilots who understood both its limitations and its lethal potential, the Dauntless was not impressive by any performance metric. Maximum speed, 255 miles per hour, slower than most fighters by nearly 100 miles per hour. Range, modest. Defensive armament, 2 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, and 1 or 2 30-caliber guns operated by the rear-seat radioman gunner. What the Dauntless possessed was precision. The aircraft could deliver a bomb within feet of a target, through a technique that required pilots to aim their entire aircraft at the enemy, dive at angles approaching vertical, and release ordnance at suicidally low altitudes. The mathematics of dive bombing were brutal and unforgiving. A pilot approaching a target at 15,000 feet would push the nose over until the aircraft reached a 70 to 75-degree dive angle. The Dauntless would accelerate rapidly, airspeed building toward 240 knots. Perforated dive brakes deployed from the wings created drag, preventing the aircraft from exceeding safe speeds and giving the pilot more time to aim. For 30 to 40 seconds, the pilot descended directly toward the target, while anti-aircraft gunners below calculated lead angles, trained their weapons, and fired. During this period, the Dauntless followed a predictable ballistic path. Gun crews could accurately estimate where the aircraft would be at any given moment. At approximately 2,000 feet altitude, the pilot released the bomb. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability. Every tactical manual, every training document, every instructor emphasized the same survival procedure. Pull back hard on the control stick, raise the dive brakes, advance throttle to full military power, climb away at maximum rate. The procedure made perfect sense. It got pilots away from the target as quickly as possible. It minimized exposure to anti-aircraft fire. It followed the laws of physics and common sense. It also created a perfectly predictable flight path that enemy gunners could anticipate and exploit. Japanese anti-aircraft crews trained extensively on exactly this scenario. American dive bombers attacked at steep angles. They released bombs at approximately 2,000 feet. They then pulled up sharply and climbed away. Gun crews positioned weapons to intersect this known flight path. When the American pilot pulled up, his aircraft flew directly into a barrage of fire, positioned precisely where the gunners knew he would be. The kill rate was devastating. In early 1942 engagements, Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed American dive bombers at unsustainable rates. During the Battle of Coral Sea, in May 1942, dive bomber squadrons suffered significant casualties. The problem was not the dive itself. The dive was too fast, too steep, too brief for effective tracking. The problem was the escape. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, Commander John S. Thatch was developing a radical new defensive maneuver for fighters that would later bear his name. The Thatch weave allowed two fighters to protect each other through coordinated weaving patterns that confused enemy pilots and created shooting opportunities. The principle was simple. Unpredictability disrupted enemy tactics. Several dive bomber instructors began discussing whether similar principles could apply to post-attack escapes. The challenge was different. A dive bomber at 500 feet altitude, having just pulled out of a high-G maneuver, flying at maximum speed over an enemy fleet, had limited energy, limited altitude, and limited time. Elaborate aerobatic maneuvers were impossible, but random, violent changes in direction might create enough unpredictability to disrupt gun-laying solutions. The tactic received an unofficial name among pilots: jinking. The term had no formal military definition. It described a series of rapid, random maneuvers intended to prevent enemy gunners from establishing an accurate track. Hard turn left for 3 seconds, roll right and pull. Push the nose down, pull back up. No pattern, no predictability. Just violent, controlled chaos that forced gun crews to constantly adjust their aim. Training doctrine did not formally incorporate jinking into dive bombing procedures. The official manual still emphasized climbing away at maximum rate, but informally, experienced pilots began teaching newer aviators the technique. During training flights over the California coast, instructors would have students practice random maneuvering at low altitude after simulated bomb runs. The physical demands were considerable. A pilot pulling 4 Gs during the dive recovery already experienced significant physiological stress. Blood pooled in the lower body, vision grayed at the edges. Some pilots experienced momentary blackouts. Immediately after recovery, while still experiencing G-load effects, the pilot had to initiate random, violent maneuvers that generated additional G-forces. Norman Kleiss learned dive bombing at Pensacola in 1940. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1938, served 2 years aboard surface ships, then entered flight training. His instructors noted good situational awareness, steady hands, and an analytical approach to flying. He joined Scouting Squadron 6 aboard USS Enterprise in May 1940. For 2 years, Cleiss practiced his craft: navigation flights over the Pacific, gunnery runs against towed targets, dive bombing practice against target sleds towed by destroyers. The repetition built muscle memory. Push over into the dive. Center the target in the telescopic sight. Account for wind drift. Release at the proper altitude. Pull out. Climb away. December 7, 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor found Enterprise at sea, having just delivered Marine aircraft to Wake Island. Scouting 6 flew combat air patrol around the carrier task force. Cleiss flew several missions that day but encountered no enemy aircraft. On December 8, while flying a patrol mission, several American destroyers mistook his Dauntless for a Japanese dive bomber and opened fire. The experience taught him about friendly fire. It also taught him about the difficulties anti-aircraft gunners faced tracking fast-moving targets. February 1, 1942. Enterprise launched an airstrike against Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands. Cleiss dropped his wing-mounted bombs on a parked aircraft at Roy Airfield. Later, he placed his 500-pound bomb on the light cruiser Katori. The ship sustained damage but remained afloat. Anti-aircraft fire was intense but poorly coordinated. Japanese gunners had little experience engaging American dive bombers. That would change. Through February, March, and April 1942, Japanese and American carrier forces clashed repeatedly across the Pacific. Each engagement provided lessons. Japanese anti-aircraft crews improved their techniques. They learned to anticipate American dive bombing tactics. They positioned guns to create kill zones in the areas where American pilots typically pulled up after attack runs. American casualties mounted May 7 through 8, 1942. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the first naval engagement in history where opposing fleets never sighted each other. All attacks came from carrier aircraft. Yorktown and Lexington launched multiple strikes against Japanese carriers Shokaku and Zuiho. Dauntless squadrons scored hits, but losses were significant. The Japanese were learning. Their gun crews tracked American dive bombers with increasing accuracy. During the pull-out phase, when American pilots followed standard procedures, pull back, raise dive brakes, climb away, they flew into concentrated fire. Several Dauntlesses were shot down during their escape rather than during their attack dive. Pilots who survived returned to their carriers with aircraft riddled by shrapnel. Debriefs revealed a pattern. The most dangerous phase was not the dive. The most dangerous phase was the escape. Japanese gunners anticipated the American pullout and positioned fire accordingly. Some pilots had instinctively begun jinking during their escapes. Hard turns immediately after pullout, random altitude changes, unpredictable flight paths. These pilots reported less accurate enemy fire. Gun crews appeared confused when targets didn't behave predictably. After Coral Sea, informal discussions spread through the Dauntless community. Veterans shared techniques. The most successful pilots described their escape maneuvers. Turn hard immediately after pullout. Don't climb straight away. Change direction every few seconds. Make the gunners guess where you'll be. June 4, 1942 approached. American codebreakers had decrypted Japanese naval communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the Japanese planned to attack Midway Atoll. He positioned 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown northeast of Midway in ambush positions. The Japanese Kido Butai, the carrier striking force that had attacked Pearl Harbor, approached from the northwest. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. Combined, they embarked over 200 aircraft operated by the most experienced carrier aviators in the world. The morning of June 4th, Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 prepared for launch from Enterprise. 32. Douglas SBD Dauntlesses spotted on the flight deck. Pilots attended final briefings. Likely target: Japanese carriers reported by patrol aircraft. Expected opposition: intense. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey would lead the strike as Air Group Commander. The mission plan was simple: find the Japanese carriers, attack from high altitude, destroy them before they could launch strikes against the American fleet. At 07:06, Enterprise began launching her air group. McCluskey led 14 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, 34 Dauntlesses, and 10 F-4F Wildcat fighters into the sky. The formation climbed to altitude and set course toward the reported Japanese position. They found nothing. For over 2 hours, McCluskey's squadron searched fruitlessly. Fuel gauges dropped toward critical levels. Some pilots calculated they no longer had enough fuel to return to Enterprise. The decision to continue searching meant possible death by fuel exhaustion. Then McCluskey spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer, Arashi, steaming at full speed. The destroyer had just finished an unsuccessful depth charge attack on the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey made an instant decision. Follow the destroyer's heading. It would lead back to the fleet. At approximately 10:20 midway time, 3 squadrons of American dive bombers converged on the Kido Butai from different directions almost simultaneously. 37 Dauntlesses from Enterprise, 17 Dauntlesses from Yorktown. The timing was not coordinated. It was extraordinarily fortunate. Minutes earlier, 3 American torpedo bomber squadrons had attacked the Japanese carriers at low altitude. All 3 squadrons were annihilated. 41 TBD Devastators attacked. 36 were shot down. Only 5 pilots survived. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, flying Mitsubishi, a 6M0 fighters, dove to sea level to intercept the slow, obsolete torpedo bombers. This left the high-altitude approaches undefended. When the Dauntlesses arrived at 15,000 feet, Japanese carriers were caught in the worst possible condition. Their decks were crowded with armed and fueled aircraft, preparing to launch strikes against the American fleet. Fuel lines were open. Ordnance was exposed. Combat Air Patrol fighters were at sea level, having just destroyed the torpedo bombers. The Japanese had no high-altitude fighter coverage. They had no early warning that dive bombers were overhead. Their first indication of attack came when American pilots pushed over into their dives. Norman Kleiss was flying as the second pilot in McCluskey's formation. When the air group commander gave the signal, Kleiss rolled his Dauntless into a 70-degree dive, aiming at Kaga. Through his telescopic sight, he could see the large red circle painted on the carrier's forward deck. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from every ship in the fleet. Black bursts filled the sky. At 2,000 feet, Kleiss released his 500-pound bomb and his 2 wing-mounted 100-pound bombs. All 3 hit Kaga's forward flight deck near the Rising Sun insignia. Massive explosions erupted as ordnance and fuel ignited. Flames engulfed the forward section of the ship. Then came the escape. Kleiss pulled back on the stick, experiencing approximately 4 Gs of force during pullout. His vision narrowed. Blood drained from his head. He performed an anti-G straining maneuver, taking a deep breath, holding it, grunting to keep blood flowing to his brain. At 500 feet altitude, traveling at over 240 knots, Kleiss was now in the heart of the Japanese fleet. Every ship had guns. Every gun was firing. The standard procedure would have been to climb away at maximum power. Kleiss turned hard left instead. The maneuver was violent, sudden, unpredictable. Japanese gun crews tracking his aircraft adjusted their aim to where he should have been climbing. Shells detonated in empty air. Kleiss turned hard right, climbed, briefly, pushed the nose down, turned left again. No pattern, no predictability, pure chaos. His radioman gunner, John Snowden, crouched behind his .30 caliber machine gun, watching anti-aircraft bursts detonate behind and above them as Kleiss's random maneuvers threw off enemy gun-laying calculations. The technique worked. Despite flying through the center of the most heavily defended fleet in the Pacific, despite every Japanese ship firing at American aircraft, Kleiss escaped without significant damage. Behind him, Kaga burned. So did Akagi. So did Soryu. 3 Japanese carriers mortally wounded in approximately 5 minutes by Douglas SBD, dauntless dive bombers attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The attacks caught Japanese defenders completely unprepared. Combat Air Patrol fighters were at the wrong altitude. Carriers were vulnerable. Timing was catastrophically perfect from the American perspective. But the bombs striking the carriers only achieved half the mission. The dauntless crews still had to escape through intense anti-aircraft fire, low on fuel, deep in enemy-controlled airspace, with Japanese Zero fighters climbing to intercept them. What happened next would validate the jinking technique and save dozens of American lives. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Douglas SBD Dauntless pilots who survived the attacks on Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu now faced a problem that no training exercise had adequately prepared them for. They were scattered across the sky at various altitudes, flying individually or in small groups, surrounded by an enraged enemy fleet whose guns tracked them with murderous intent. Zero fighters were climbing rapidly from sea level, having finished destroying the torpedo bomber squadrons. Fuel gauges showed levels that made the return trip to Enterprise questionable at best. Lieutenant Junior Grade Franco Flaherty, flying from Enterprise's Scouting Squadron 6, pulled out of his dive after hitting Kaga. His rear gunner, aviation machinist's mate Bruno Guido, immediately spotted 3 Zeros climbing toward them from below. O'Flaherty did not climb away as doctrine suggested. Instead, he stayed low, at approximately 500 feet, and began a series of radical turns that prevented the Zeros from establishing firing solutions. Turn left, hold for 3 seconds, snap right, push the nose down toward the waves, pull back up. Turn left again. Each maneuver threw off Japanese fighter pilots' aim by forcing them to constantly recalculate deflection angles. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, armed with heavier weapons, but they could not hit what they could not predict. Guido fired his single .30 caliber machine gun whenever a Zero crossed his sights. The defensive fire was not effective in destroying enemy fighters, but it forced them to maneuver, breaking their attack runs. For several minutes, O'Flaherty jinked violently across the ocean surface, while 3 Zeros pursued. Eventually, the Japanese pilots broke off, either low on fuel or called back to defend the burning carriers. O'Flaherty and Guido escaped. Their aircraft, riddled with bullet holes, landed on Enterprise nearly out of fuel. Post-flight inspection revealed over 30 bullet strikes, but nothing had hit critical systems. The random maneuvering had prevented concentrated fire from finding vital areas. Other pilots were not as fortunate. Ensign Tom Eversole, also from Scouting 6, followed standard procedure after his attack. He pulled up sharply, raised his dive brakes, and climbed away at full throttle in a straight line. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, tracking his predictable climb, placed a barrage directly in his path. Shells struck his engine. The Dauntless caught fire, rolled inverted, and plunged into the ocean. Neither Eversole nor his gunner survived. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Pilots who jinked during their escapes survived at significantly higher rates than pilots who followed standard climb-away procedures. The difference was not subtle. It was the difference between life and death. At approximately 1300 hours on June 4th, Enterprise and Hornet launched a second strike against the remaining Japanese carrier, Hiryu. The strike included Dauntlesses from both carriers, plus homeless aircraft from Yorktown, which had been damaged by Japanese counterattacks. These pilots had been briefed on the success of the morning strikes. They had also been briefed on the casualties. The message was clear: jink during your escape or die. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led Bombing Squadron 6 against Hiryu. Norman Kleiss flew in this strike as well, making his second attack of the day. At 17:03, 24 Dauntlesses rolled into their dives. Hiryu, having spent the afternoon launching strikes against American carriers, was caught in the same vulnerable condition that had doomed her sister ships that morning. Armed and fueled aircraft crowded her deck. Bombs rained down. At least 4 struck the carrier. Fires erupted immediately, fed by aviation fuel and munitions. Hiryu transformed into an inferno within minutes. The dive bomber pilots pulled out and immediately began violent evasive maneuvers. Kleiss turned hard left, then right, varying his altitude constantly. Anti-aircraft fire from Hiryu and her escorts filled the sky, but the shells consistently detonated behind or above the American aircraft. The gunners could not track targets that refused to fly predictably. Kleiss scored his second hit of the day, a 500-pound bomb near Hiryu's bow. He was the only pilot in the entire battle to score direct hits on 3 separate Japanese ships: Kaga in the morning strike, Hiryu in the afternoon strike, and later the heavy cruiser Mikuma on June 6th. His survival through 3 separate attacks against Idate, heavily defended targets demonstrated the effectiveness of unpredictable post-attack maneuvering. 18 of the 47 Dauntlesses that struck the Japanese carriers on the morning of June 4th never returned to their carriers. 2 more ditched near the fleet when they ran out of fuel. The losses were significant, representing approximately 40% of the attacking force. But the losses would have been catastrophically higher without jinking tactics. Japanese after-action reports from surviving anti-aircraft crews noted with frustration the difficulty of tracking American dive bombers during their escape phases. Gunners reported that American pilots maneuvered wildly and unpredictably, making accurate fire control impossible. Pre-war training had emphasized tracking aircraft, following standard escape procedures. The Americans had stopped following standard procedures. The Battle of Midway ended on June 7, 1942. 4 Japanese carriers had been sunk. The Kido Butai, the most powerful naval striking force in the world, had been destroyed. The strategic balance in the Pacific shifted fundamentally. Japan would never again possess the carrier strength to threaten American naval supremacy. The tactical lessons learned at Midway spread rapidly through the Navy's dive bomber community. Jinking was no longer an informal technique practiced by a few experienced pilots. It became standard doctrine taught to every dauntless pilot in training. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, instructors modified dive bombing training syllabi. After students mastered basic dive technique, pushover, dive angle control, bomb release, pull-out, they learned escape procedures. The new doctrine emphasized violent, random maneuvering immediately after pull-out. No straight climbs, no predictable patterns, constant direction changes until clear of enemy defenses. Students practiced the technique during training flights. After simulated bomb runs, instructors would have students perform random maneuvers at low altitude. Turn left, roll right, vary altitude. The objective was to build muscle memory so that jinking became automatic rather than something requiring conscious thought during the stress of combat. The physical demands remained considerable, pulling 4 to 6 Gs during dive recovery, then immediately initiating additional high G maneuvers pushed human physiology to its limits. Some pilots grayed out or temporarily lost vision, the anti-G straining maneuver, taking deep breaths, holding them, grunting to maintain blood pressure, became essential technique taught alongside jinking. August 7th through 9th, 1942, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. American and Japanese carrier forces clashed again. Dauntless squadrons from Enterprise and Saratoga attacked the Japanese light carrier Ryujo. The pilots, now trained in jinking procedures, attacked and escaped with lower casualty rates than earlier engagements. Lieutenant Turner Caldwell led Scouting Squadron 5 from Saratoga in the attack on Ryujo. After bombing the carrier, Caldwell's pilots scattered across the sky, each aircraft jinking independently. Japanese anti-aircraft fire, while intense, achieved few hits. Ryujo sank, but American losses were minimal. The contrast with earlier battles was notable. Better tactics meant higher survival rates. October 26, 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. This engagement produced one of the war's most remarkable dauntless stories, though not directly related to jinking. Lieutenant Stanley Swedve Tasa, flying a Dauntless on combat air patrol, shot down 7 Japanese aircraft in a single mission, 2 Val dive bombers and 5 Kate torpedo bombers, while flying a nominally defensive aircraft. His aggressiveness and skill demonstrated that the Dauntless, despite being a dive bomber, could engage enemy aircraft effectively when necessary. But the battle also reinforced jinking doctrine. Lieutenant Stockton Strong, flying from Enterprise, attacked the carrier Zuiho. After releasing his bomb, Strong initiated violent evasive maneuvers as Japanese Zeros dove on him. He turned, rolled, and varied altitude constantly while his rear gunner, aviation radioman third-class Ote Bates, engaged the Zeros with his .30 caliber machine gun. The combination of jinking and defensive fire kept the Zeros from establishing killing shots. Strong and Bates escaped. Through late 1942 and into 1943, Dauntless squadrons continued operating from both carriers and land bases throughout the Pacific. Marine squadrons flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal attacked Japanese ships attempting to reinforce the island. Navy squadrons participated in strikes against targets across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. Each mission reinforced the importance of unpredictable maneuvering. Pilots who jinked survived. Pilots who followed pre-war doctrine straight climbs away from targets died at higher rates. The statistics were clear and undeniable. Japanese defensive doctrine also evolved. Anti-aircraft crews learned to fire barrage patterns rather than tracking individual aircraft. By filling volumes of airspace with shrapnel, they hoped to hit randomly maneuvering targets through probability rather than precision. This tactic achieved some success, but American casualty rates remained lower than they had been in early 1942. The Japanese also increased fighter coverage over their fleets. The lesson of Midway, where dive bombers attacked unopposed because fighters were at the wrong altitude, was not lost on Japanese commanders. Combat air patrols now maintained fighters at multiple altitudes, specifically to intercept high-altitude dive bombers. This created new challenges for American pilots. Escaping through anti-aircraft fire while jinking was difficult. Escaping through anti-aircraft fire while jinking and evading fighters was exponentially more dangerous. Some pilots did not survive, but jinking remained the best available tactic for maximizing survival probability. By mid-1943, the Douglas SBD Dauntless was being supplemented and eventually replaced by the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, a larger, faster, more powerful dive bomber. The Helldiver could carry heavier bomb loads and had better performance characteristics. But many pilots preferred the Dauntless. It was more forgiving, had better low-speed handling, and was extraordinarily rugged. The jinking doctrine developed on the Dauntless transferred directly to the Helldiver. Pilots attacking in the new aircraft followed the same post-attack procedures: violent, random maneuvering until clear of enemy defenses. The principle remained valid regardless of aircraft type. June 19th through 20th, 1944. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the last major engagement for carrier-based Dauntlesses. American carriers launched strikes against Japanese forces in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation had been bled white by 2 years of attrition. American pilots, better trained and flying superior aircraft, destroyed Japanese air groups with minimal losses. 26 Dauntlesses participated in a long-range strike against retreating Japanese carriers. All 26 returned safely despite attacking at extreme range in deteriorating weather. The mission demonstrated how far dive bombing tactics had evolved since 1942. Pilots attacked with precision, escaped through competent jinking, and navigated back to their carriers in darkness. Norman "Dusty" Kleiss, the pilot who had scored 3 hits during the Battle of Midway, did not participate in the Philippine Sea operation. After Midway, he had been assigned as an instructor at Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia, and later at Naval Auxiliary Air Station Cecil Field, Florida. He spent the remainder of the war training new dive bomber pilots, passing on the techniques that had kept him alive through 3 attacks against heavily defended Japanese ships. His students learned dive bombing fundamentals: angle control, sight picture, bomb release timing. But they also learned the critical importance of unpredictable escape maneuvers. Kleiss would demonstrate jinking during training flights, rolling his Dauntless through violent turns at low altitude while students watched and learned. The technique he had helped pioneer at Midway became standard doctrine taught to every dive bomber pilot in the Navy. By 1945, the Pacific War had moved beyond the carrier versus carrier battles that characterized 1942 and 43. American forces were closing on the Japanese home islands. Strategic bombing by B-29 superfortresses replaced tactical carrier strikes as the primary means of attacking Japan. Dive bombers continued operating in support of amphibious invasions, but the era of massive carrier air battles had ended. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was retired from frontline service in mid-1944, replaced by the SB-2C Helldiver. But Marine squadrons continued flying Dauntlesses until the end of the war. The last combat missions flown by Dauntlesses occurred in August 1945, just before Japan's surrender. The aircraft's combat record was extraordinary. Dauntlesses sank more enemy shipping than any other Allied bomber in the Pacific. The official tally included 6 aircraft carriers, 14 cruisers, 6 destroyers, 15 transports or cargo ships, and countless smaller vessels. The carrier victories alone, Shoho at Coral Sea, 4 carriers at Midway, Hiryu at Midway again, Ryujo at Eastern Solomons, and contributions to sinking other carriers changed the course of the Pacific War. But statistics do not capture the human cost. Hundreds of Dauntless pilots and radioman gunners died in combat. They died in burning aircraft. They died in the ocean after being shot down. They died when damaged aircraft crashed, attempting to return to carriers. The casualty rates, particularly in early engagements, were devastating. The development of jinking tactics reduced those casualties significantly. While exact statistics are difficult to compile, post-war analysis of combat reports suggests that pilots who employed random evasive maneuvers during escape phases survived at rates 20 to 30% higher than pilots who followed pre-war straight-line climb-away doctrine. 20 to 30% might not sound dramatic, but in the context of combat, where tens of thousands of sorties were flown, that difference represented hundreds of pilots who survived instead of dying. Hundreds of families who received their sons, husbands, and fathers back after the war instead of receiving telegrams expressing the Navy's regret. The tactical evolution from predictable to unpredictable escape maneuvers demonstrates a fundamental principle of aerial warfare. Doctrine based on peacetime assumptions often fails when confronted with combat reality. The pre-war doctrine, climb away at maximum rate after attacking, made theoretical sense. It minimized time over target. It followed logical principles of geometry and physics, but it failed to account for enemy adaptation. Japanese anti-aircraft crews learned to anticipate American escape procedures and position fire accordingly. Once the doctrine became predictable, it became lethal. The pilots who survived were the ones who recognized that predictability was the enemy. They adapted. They improvised. They developed new techniques not found in any manual. And eventually, those techniques became the new doctrine taught to every student at every flight school. Norman Kleiss survived the war. He served as an instructor through 1944, then attended Naval Postgraduate School. After the war, he worked in the Bureau of Aeronautics, becoming head of Structures Branch in 1949. He later served as the Navy's representative at Lockheed Corporation, supervising aircraft inspectors, engineers, and test pilots. He retired from the Navy and lived quietly in Virginia for decades. In 2007, at age 91, he published his memoir, Never Call Me a Hero, co-written with his daughter Laura Orr and Tim Orr. The book provided a detailed account of his experiences at Midway and throughout the war. Kleiss died on April 22, 2016. At age 100, he was the last surviving dive bomber pilot to have scored hits during the Battle of Midway. His death marked the end of an era. The men who had flown Dauntlesses into combat, who had pioneered the tactics that changed naval warfare, were gone. But their legacy remained. The principle they demonstrated that unpredictability disrupts enemy defenses more effectively than any amount of armor or speed continues to influence aerial tactics. Modern strike aircraft employ random maneuvering during ingress and egress from target areas. Electronic warfare systems create unpredictable jamming patterns. Stealth technology makes aircraft unpredictable to radar. The fundamental concept remains valid across technological generations. The story of jinking, of the chaotic post-attack maneuvering that confused Japanese gunners and saved American pilots, is not as dramatic as the story of the bombs that sank carriers. There are no iconic photographs of pilots jinking. The maneuver does not lend itself to visual representation or Hollywood dramatization. It was simply pilots throwing their aircraft around the sky in violent, random patterns, trying to stay alive long enough to get home. But that unglamorous, undramatic technique saved more lives than any single piece of technology or tactical innovation in the dive bomber war. It turned predictable targets into unpredictable ghosts that enemy gunners could not track. It bought pilots the few extra seconds they needed to escape the kill zone and survive. The morning of June 4, 1942, when Norman Kleiss rolled his Dauntless inverted, dove deeper toward the enemy fleet, then snapped into violent, random turns instead of climbing away predictably, he was improvising. He was trusting instinct over doctrine. He was choosing chaos over order. He was also pioneering a technique that would become standard doctrine and save hundreds of American lives over the next 3 years of war. The Japanese gun crews that morning, trained to track aircraft following predictable escape profiles, found themselves firing at empty air. Their shells detonated where American pilots should have been but weren't. Their carefully calculated fire solutions became worthless against targets that refused to behave predictably. In the end, the greatest tactical innovation at the Battle of Midway might not have been the coordinated timing of multiple squadrons attacking simultaneously. It might not have been the courage of torpedo bomber crews who pressed attacks despite impossible odds. It might have been something simpler and more fundamental. It might have been the recognition that in war, predictability kills and chaos saves. That doctrine must adapt to reality or be discarded. That survival often depends on doing the opposite of what the enemy expects. The Douglas SBD Dauntless, nicknamed Slow but Deadly, proved deadly not just because of the bombs it carried, but because of the pilots who flew it. Pilots who understood that getting the bomb on target was only half the mission. The other half was getting home alive. And getting home alive often meant doing something crazy, rolling inverted when instinct screamed to climb, diving deeper when logic demanded altitude, turning randomly when efficiency suggested straight lines. The gunners below tracked predictable targets. The pilots above refused to be predictable. That refusal, that embrace of controlled chaos, made all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.